There's a question that every intelligence officer eventually stops asking out loud, not because the answer becomes clear, but because asking it starts to interfere with the work. The question is simple. At what point does the man you're watching cease to be a person and become only a problem to be solved? The officer we'll call Aleph had been in this work for 11 years. She had run surveillance operations in 4 countries. She had written targeting assessments on 9 individuals. She had never been the one in the vehicle with the final command. That was about to change. The file on the man Israeli intelligence had been tracking for 4 years was not a file about a monster. That's the first thing that makes this story difficult to hold. It was a file about a logistics coordinator, a man who had built, over roughly 3 years, a procurement network that moved precision-grade components from Eastern European suppliers through intermediary front companies and into manufacturing cells operating inside Gaza. He did not build bombs. He ensured that the people who did could source what they needed without triggering export controls or customs flags. The distinction mattered legally. Whether it mattered morally was a question the file did not answer. His name has not been officially confirmed by Israeli authorities in connection with this operation. In the investigative reporting that has circled this case, analysts and journalists working from intercept summaries and financial forensics have described him in terms consistent with a mid to senior tier Hamas military logistics figure, significant enough to sit on the targeted elimination list that Israel's government publicly acknowledged maintaining after October 7, 2023, but not a name the public would recognize. He was not Sinwar. He was not Deif. He was the infrastructure that made Sinwar and Deif possible. And he was, on a Wednesday morning in late spring, standing outside a university building in a European city, holding a bouquet of white and yellow flowers, waiting for his daughter to walk across a stage and receive her diploma. Aleph was watching him on a live surveillance feed from a vehicle parked 2 kilometers away. She had been watching him in various forms for 72 hours. The first unresolved risk sitting at the center of this operation had nothing to do with the target and everything to do with the location. He was not in Gaza. He was not in Lebanon or Syria, or any geography where Israeli operations had established precedent, and where the diplomatic fallout, while real, was anticipated and priced in. He was in a country that maintained functional, if cautious, relations with Israel. A country whose security services had not been informed. A country that had, in its own history, hosted Israeli operations it later discovered only through the headlines. Proceeding meant accepting that relationship as a cost, not damaging it beyond repair, probably, but damaging it. The targeting approval had come from above Aleph's level. She had not been in the room where that cost was weighed. She had been handed a file, a window, and a team. The second unresolved risk was more immediate and had a name, though Aleph only knew her as the daughter. She was 23 years old. She was enrolled in an architecture program. She had, based on the surveillance pattern of the previous 11 weeks, a complicated relationship with her father. She called him infrequently, and the calls, when they occurred, were short. Whether this was the ordinary distance of a young adult life or something more freighted, the surveillance could not determine. What the surveillance had determined was her approximate position within the graduating cohort, her likely exit route from the ceremony hall, and the radius within which she would be standing relative to the window the team had identified. That radius had shifted that morning. The graduation cohort's positioning had been reorganized by the university. An administrative change, apparently routine, that moved the daughters group to a different exit corridor. The shift was logged by the ground team at 9:14 a.m. Aleph received the updated data at 9:31 a.m. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m. 29 minutes to rerun the proximity model. She ran it twice. The margin narrowed but held within the threshold the operation's parameters defined as acceptable. Acceptable was the word. She used it in her own internal notation. Later, she would think about that word and what it did and did not contain. The ground team was composed of 4 people. 2 had been embedded in the city for 6 weeks under commercial cover. 1 as a consultant affiliated with a technology firm that actually existed and had no connection to Israeli intelligence. 1 as a graduate student enrolled in a short-term academic exchange program. The other 2 had arrived 48 hours earlier with documentation that would survive routine inspection and would not survive a serious investigation. This was the seam in the operation that Aleph did not raise with her command and did not stop thinking about. If anything went wrong, not catastrophically wrong, just procedurally wrong, the kind of wrong where a local police officer became curious about the wrong vehicle at the wrong moment, the documentation on the 2 recent arrivals would hold for hours, maybe a day, not longer. And an investigation that lasted longer than a day would eventually find threads that led back through the commercial cover to a place that made the diplomatic cost calculation look naive in retrospect. The operation had been planned around a clean exit. Clean exits depend on nothing going procedurally wrong, and nothing going procedurally wrong depends on a set of conditions that 4 people in a foreign city, operating without host country knowledge, cannot fully control. Aleph had flagged this in her preliminary assessment. The flag had been acknowledged and the operation had proceeded. In intelligence work, a flag that is acknowledged and overruled is still a flag. It does not become invisible. It sits in the file and it sits in your thinking and you carry it into the vehicle with you. She carried it. The man with the flowers had moved inside now. The ceremony would begin in less than 20 minutes. Aleph could see him on the feed from a camera her team had positioned with line of sight to the interior lobby. A small, unremarkable device that looked, to anyone who noticed it, like part of the building's own infrastructure. He was talking to a woman near him, someone who appeared to be a faculty member based on her lanyard and the way she gestured toward the hall. He was smiling. He smiled the way people smile when they have decided, for the duration of a particular day, to be only the version of themselves that belongs to that day. Aleph noted the time. She pulled up the corridor diagram on the secondary screen. She looked at the window, the specific 90-second gap between the end of the ceremony and the beginning of the outdoor reception, when the target's own protection pattern suggested he would step into the covered side corridor to make a call or compose himself before the crowd descended on him. He always stepped away from crowds before re-entering them. It was a pattern so consistent across 43 observation instances that it had been given a label in the surveillance notes. He would step away. The question Aleph had not asked anyone, and had not fully asked herself, was this, the intelligence that had placed him at the center of the procurement network, was 4 months old in its most recent verified layer. The world in which that intelligence was collected was not static. Networks reorganized, roles shifted, people were promoted, sidelined, made redundant by the same organizational logic that made them indispensable 6 months earlier. Was the man who had walked into that ceremony hall this morning the same operational node that the 4-month-old intelligence described? The protocol did not require her to answer that question. The targeting package had been validated. The legal review had been completed. The operational window had been approved. But the question existed, and no one had handed her the answer. Inside the hall, applause began. The ceremony had started. The man she was watching would be a father for approximately another 40 minutes. What she did not know yet, what nobody in that vehicle knew, was that 3 weeks earlier, a human source with access to Hamas Military Council communications had sent a report through a separate intelligence channel. A report that was still moving through the processing queue. A report that, had it arrived 4 days sooner, might have changed a question nobody in this vehicle had thought to ask. It had not arrived 4 days sooner. The applause continued. Aleph watched the corridor diagram and waited. The ceremony lasted 53 minutes. Aleph watched most of it on the feed without moving. The ground team checked in at 3 intervals using a protocol that generated no transmissions detectable as communications, a system of timed non-events, the absence of a signal meaning one thing, the presence of another signal meaning something else. In 53 minutes, nothing went wrong. That is its own kind of tension. When nothing goes wrong for long enough, you start to feel the wrongness gathering somewhere you can't see. At 11:04 a.m., the hall began to empty. The graduates came out in clusters, robes still on, holding their folders, finding their families. The man Aleph was tracking emerged from the main doors at 11:09 a.m. He was with his daughter. She still had her graduation cap on. He had the flowers in one hand and his phone in the other, and he was laughing at something she said. The ground team's camera had a clean angle. Aleph watched him laugh. The outdoor reception was set up in the main courtyard, tables, a small catering arrangement, faculty moving through the crowd. It was loud in the way those events are loud, layered, warm, the specific acoustic texture of people who are relieved that something important went well. He moved into the courtyard with his daughter. He introduced her to someone, an older couple, possibly family, though the surveillance had not confirmed any other relatives traveling for this event. He accepted a glass of something. He stayed close to his daughter for the first 11 minutes of the reception. Then, at 11:21 a.m., he did what he always did. He stepped away. He moved toward the covered side corridor, the same corridor the model had identified, the same geometry the team had prepared for. He was already reaching for his phone. He walked at the pace of a man who planned to be back in 4 minutes. Aleph gave the alert to the ground team, and then the team leader on the ground. The one who had been embedded for 6 weeks, the one whose cover was strongest, sent back a signal that was not part of the standard protocol. It meant, hold. There was a man in the corridor, not the target. A university staff member, a facilities worker, based on his clothing, who had been moving through the corridor with the service cart and had stopped, apparently because a wheel on the cart had caught on something. He was crouching down, working the wheel free. He was directly in the geometry. He had 40 seconds of work left, maybe 60. The target was 20 meters from the corridor entrance and moving at a steady pace. Aleph had a choice that the protocol gave her a name for, and that the name did not fully describe. She could hold and reassess. She could abort and attempt to re-establish a window later in the day, at the reception, though no secondary window had been prepared with the same level of proximity modeling. Or she could proceed and accept an expanded civilian proximity radius. She held. The facilities worker cleared the cart at 11:23 a.m. He moved out of the corridor at 11:24 a.m. The target entered the corridor at 11:24 a.m. The window that the model had specified as 90 seconds materialized, and Aleph gave the command, and the operation proceeded. What she did not know, in the 11 seconds between the command and the confirmation, was that the facilities worker had stopped again at the corridor's far end to make a note on a clipboard. He was 8 meters outside the projected radius. He was not looking in the right direction. The physical harm assessment still held. He heard it. He did not know, in that moment, what he had heard. The investigation that followed would eventually find him and take his statement, and he would describe the sound as something that did not register as violence until he saw the other people running. He was not physically harmed. The word acceptable continued to do its work. The ground team exited the city within the parameters the plan had established. The 2 recent arrivals were out within 90 minutes. The embedded team followed their own separate exfiltration timeline over the next 36 hours, maintaining cover through the initial period of confusion and the arrival of local law enforcement. Nothing went procedurally wrong. The flag that Aleph had raised about the documentation held. The seam she had identified and carried into the vehicle was never pulled. The host country's investigation generated diplomatic complaints through official channels. There was no public attribution, no press conference, no confirmation from any Israeli government official. The operation was, by every metric the after-action process applied to it, a success. Now, hold that. Hold the word success and what it is built on. 3 weeks after the operation, the human source report finished moving through the processing queue. It was assessed, flagged as high reliability, and routed to the relevant analytical team. The team that received it included analysts who had worked on the original targeting package for the coordinator. The report's core finding, reconstructed from the source's access to Hamas Military Council communications, was this. In the 8 months preceding the operation, the coordinator's procurement network had been deliberately replicated. Not dismantled, not compromised, replicated. Hamas military logistics had, as an organizational response to the pressure of the post-October 7th Israeli targeting campaign, built redundancy into its supply chains. 2 parallel procurement networks had been stood up, each managed separately, each capable of performing the functions the coordinator's network performed. The coordinator had known about one of them. He had, according to the source, been in conflict with the military council about the second. He believed the redundancy was also a signal that his operational centrality was being deliberately reduced. He was correct. In the months before his death, he had been in the early stages of being managed out of his core role, shifted toward an advisory function while the newer networks absorbed his operational responsibilities. The intelligence that had built the targeting case, the intercepts, the financial forensics, the supply chain mapping was accurate. Everything it described had existed. The coordinator had built what the file said he built. What the file described was a past tense. By the time Aleph sat in that vehicle, the structure that justified the operation had already been redistributed into 2 other networks that the targeting package had identified as secondary concerns: early formation, lower current value, worth monitoring but not yet worth the cost of action. Remove the coordinator, and those networks lost the benefit of his institutional knowledge and his supplier relationships. That was a real degradation. It was not nothing, but the operation had been scoped and approved and executed on the premise that he was the load-bearing element of a structure. The structure had already learned to stand without him. Inside the analytical team that received the source report, there was a conversation that did not generate a formal record. This is, in intelligence work, how certain conversations happen, not because anyone is hiding something, but because the institutional reflex is to contain the implications of information that arrives too late to change what it would have changed. One analyst asked a question that another analyst answered by pointing to the targeting criteria documentation and noting that the criteria had been met based on the intelligence available at the time of approval. This is correct. This is also the place where correctness and sufficiency stop overlapping. The targeting criteria were met. The intelligence was assessed accurately given what was available. The legal review was valid. The operational execution was clean. And the network the operation was designed to degrade was, 7 months later, still functioning. Managed by people the targeting package had not yet elevated to priority status, using supplier relationships the coordinator had spent 3 years building and had, in his final months, been in the process of transferring. He had not been removed from the network. He had been in the process of leaving it. The operation accelerated a transition that was already underway. Aleph received a version of the source report through her own chain. Not the full document, a summary, 3 paragraphs, the kind of notification that functions as institutional acknowledgement without requiring institutional response. She read it once. She did not respond to it formally. There was no process by which she was expected to respond to it. The operation was closed. The after action was filed. The source report arrived into a completed operational record the way late mail arrives at a house where the people have already moved. What she thought, reading those 3 paragraphs, is not on record. What she had authorized was the death of a man who was, at the moment of his death, in the process of becoming less dangerous than he had been. What she had protected, by ensuring the facility's worker cleared the corridor, by holding the command for 60 seconds, by running the proximity model 3 times, was a civilian radius that the protocol defined and that the protocol could not fully define. The daughter had been 40 meters away. The facility's worker had been 8 meters outside the projected radius. Both of them were unharmed. The network continued, and somewhere in the processing queue of the intelligence apparatus, another file was already being built on the 2 people who had absorbed the coordinator-supplier relationships, on the newer networks, on the structure that had learned to redistribute itself before anyone came to remove its center. The work, as it always does, had already moved on. Whether the operation had changed anything, or whether it had confirmed something, was a question the source report didn't answer and the after action didn't ask. That question doesn't have a queue. It doesn't get processed, it just stays open. The corridor was 31 meters long and covered by a translucent roof that filtered the late morning light into something pale and even. There were no windows on the east wall. The west wall had 3 doors, 2 locked service entries, and one that led back into the main building's administrative wing. At the far end, a fire door that opened outward onto a narrow service lane. The target entered from the courtyard side at 11:24 a.m. He was alone. He was already looking at his phone screen as he walked, the way people do when they've been social for hours and need 30 seconds of private attention to something that has been waiting. His pace was unhurried. He did not look behind him. Aleph had the feed from 2 angles. She had the ground team's positional confirmations. She had the window. She gave the alert. And then she saw something on the feed that the model had not included because the model could not have included it. The corridor's far door, the one that opened onto the service lane, was propped open. A thin wedge of outside light was visible at the bottom. It had not been propped open during any of the 11 prior surveillance walkthroughs. Someone had propped it open recently. Probably the facilities worker on his way through, probably without thinking about it. The ordinary, unconscious behavior of someone moving a cart through a door and needing both hands. The fire door being open meant the service lane was accessible. It meant the service lane could have someone in it who now had a lateral sightline into the corridor's far end. Aleph did not have a camera on the service lane. She held the command. She asked the ground team for a visual on the service lane. The ground team's positioned assets did not have a direct angle. The team leader ran a rapid reassessment. 40 seconds of silence on the protocol channel. 40 seconds of Aleph watching the target move deeper into the corridor, phone still in hand, unhurried, with no awareness that anything around him had become uncertain. The reassessment came back, probable, clear. No visual confirmation. Probable. Probable is not confirmed. In the gap between those 2 words, the entire operational risk calculus lives. The target had been in the corridor for 55 seconds. The window was 90 seconds. She had 35 seconds of window remaining and an unconfirmed sightline risk on a service lane she couldn't see. She held. At 68 seconds, the target stopped walking. He had reached a point roughly 2/3 down the corridor, past the locked service doors, short of the fire door's light, and he stopped and leaned slightly against the wall the way people do when the call they've pulled up requires a moment of stillness. He was looking at his screen. He appeared to be reading something rather than dialing. The window closed at 90 seconds. Aleph noted the time, 11:25 a.m. and 40 seconds, and did not give the command. The window was gone. The target was still in the corridor, but the geometry that the window was built on, the specific combination of his position, The civilian radius, the team's prepared angles, had expired. Proceeding now meant proceeding outside the prepared parameters. That was a different operational decision that required a different authorization. She did not have it and did not seek it in the moment, because seeking it would take longer than the target would remain in the corridor. At 11:26 a.m., the target pocketed his phone and walked back toward the courtyard. The ground team lead sent a non-standard signal. In the protocol's vocabulary, it meant standing by, awaiting new window assessment. Aleph did not respond immediately. She was already running the secondary assessment in her head. The reception was still ongoing. The target would be in the courtyard for an undetermined period. The courtyard had no prepared geometry. The crowd density had increased since the ceremony ended as families arrived and mingled. The daughter was somewhere in that crowd. The secondary window the operations planning had acknowledged but not fully developed was not a window. It was a contingency notation. It said, if primary window is missed, assess courtyard feasibility on site. It did not say how. It did not model the crowd. It did not account for the fact that in a courtyard full of graduates and families, the civilian proximity radius was not 40 meters. It was 4. Aleph made a decision that was not the abort decision but functioned like one in the short term. She told the ground team to hold position and maintain surveillance. She did not say abort. She did not say proceed. She said hold, which bought time without closing the operation and without committing to a window that didn't exist yet. Holding had a cost. Every minute the ground team stayed in position was a minute inside a posture that had not been designed for extended duration. The embedded team's cover was built for movement, not stillness. Parked vehicles in the wrong place for too long became visible. Visible things became questions. She held anyway. At 11:41 a.m., the operation generated its false release. The target moved again. He had separated from the main cluster of the reception. His daughter was with the older couple Aleph had noted earlier, the possible relatives, and he was walking toward the courtyard's eastern edge, where the crowd thinned. There was a low wall there, benches, a gap in the foot traffic that the surveillance feed showed clearly. The gap was real. The thinning was real. The geometry was not prepared, but it was not impossible. The ground team lead sent a query signal. Do you want assessment on eastern edge? Aleph pulled up the feed angle on the eastern edge. She looked at the crowd between the target and the edge. She looked at the benches. She looked at who was sitting on them. 2 elderly people, a couple. Not related to the event, apparently, just the ordinary municipal presence of people who use university courtyards in the late morning. She asked the ground team for a proximity read on the benches. 11 meters. She asked about the daughter's current position. 38 meters facing away. She ran the numbers. 11 meters from 2 unrelated civilians whose presence had not been in any model, who had arrived here through no decision anyone in this operation had made, who were sitting on a bench on a Wednesday because the weather was acceptable, and they had nowhere particular to be. The protocol's threshold for acceptable civilian proximity was not 11 meters in an open courtyard. The protocol had been written for controlled environments with predictable geometries. Aleph knew what the protocol said. She also knew that the protocol's authors had not been looking at 2 people sitting on a bench 11 meters from a decision she was being asked to make in real time. She did not give the assessment to the ground team. She gave them a different signal. She told them the eastern edge was not viable. What happened next was not in the operational record as a near abort because no one formally designated it as one. But what it functionally was, and what Aleph understood it as in the moment, was the closest the operation came to ending without a completed execution. She was running out of windows. The reception would not last indefinitely. The target would eventually leave with his daughter, enter a vehicle, disappear into the city's traffic, and the operational window for this date would close. Rescheduling meant a new planning cycle, new documentation exposure, new risk accumulation, and the source report sitting in the processing queue, the one nobody in this vehicle knew about yet, would eventually arrive and change the calculus entirely, though Aleph had no way of knowing that. What she knew was this: she had one team, one approved operation, one date, and a target who was standing in a courtyard full of people she had not been given tools to protect. At 11:52 a.m., the target moved a third time. He stepped away from the eastern edge, away from the elderly couple, away from his daughter's cluster, and walked toward the covered side corridor again. Not to make a call this time. He was looking for something. A staff member, apparently, someone he needed to speak to before he left. He entered the corridor from the courtyard side for the second time. The fire door at the far end was now closed. The facilities worker was not in the corridor. The civilian radius was clear. The window, unrequested and unmodeled, had returned. Aleph had the feed. She had the geometry. She had the team in position. She had the assumptions the operation had been built on. The targeting package, the legal review, the 4-month-old intelligence picture she didn't yet know was 4 months old, and she had a man walking into a corridor for the second time on the same morning, apparently because the day kept producing ordinary reasons for him to be alone. She gave the command. The confirmation came through at 11:54 a.m. Aleph noted the time in her operational log. She put the pen down. She did not say anything to the two people in the vehicle with her. There was nothing in the protocol that specified what you said in the 30 seconds after a command you gave produced the outcome it was designed to produce. The ground team was already moving. Outside, in the courtyard, nobody knew yet. The reception continued. The layered acoustic texture of 100 conversations, glasses, movement, the specific sound of an ordinary Wednesday that had not yet received new information. The daughter was still with the older couple. Someone was taking a photograph. The corridor was 31 meters from the courtyard entrance. It took 4 minutes for the first person to understand that something had happened. The local emergency response arrived at 12:09 a.m. By that point, the two recent arrivals on the ground team were already in a vehicle moving toward the city's eastern arterial. The embedded team members had separated, one remaining at a cafe 2 blocks from the university, maintaining cover by continuing to be visibly present and unremarkable, one moving on a separate route toward their extraction point. The facilities worker gave his statement to the first officer on scene. He described the sound. He described not knowing what it was. He described walking back into the corridor and seeing something he was still, months later, unable to fully articulate in the interviews that followed. He had been 8 meters outside the projected radius. He had propped the fire door open without thinking about it, which had caused Aleph to hold the command for the first window, which had pushed the operation into improvised territory, which had ultimately not changed the outcome but had changed the texture of every decision between the first window and the second. The fire door was one man's unconscious habit. It had shaped the operational geometry for 30 minutes. Nobody would ever account for it in any document. The host country's foreign ministry issued a formal diplomatic protest within 72 hours. The language was measured, the kind of measured that means serious without requiring immediate rupture. The investigation was opened. Israeli government officials made no public statement. The host country's intelligence service, in a separate and private communication channel, conveyed something closer to the actual register of their response, which was considerably less measured than the formal protest. The relationship between the two services, which had involved, over the preceding decade, cooperation on counterterrorism intelligence relevant to both countries, entered what one analyst later described in a published retrospective as a functional suspension. Not a break, a suspension. The kind where both sides continue to receive each other's communications and neither side responds with the same speed they used to. This had been a known cost. It had been weighed. The people who weighed it had concluded it was acceptable. The flag Aleph had raised about the documentation, about the two recent arrivals whose cover would not survive a serious investigation, had been the flag that anticipated this exact scenario. A serious investigation had begun. The documentation held for 31 hours before the host country's investigators identified an inconsistency in the entry records of one team member. By that point, the team member was outside the country's jurisdiction. The inconsistency was enough to confirm, for the host country's investigators, what they had already largely concluded through other means. It was not enough to produce a legal case that went anywhere public. The investigation produced a classified report. The report was shared, in summary form, with 2 allied intelligence services as a professional courtesy and a warning. The warning was about methodology, about the specific documentation approach, about the seam Aleph had identified and that had held, but only just, and only because the timeline had compressed in the operation's favor. The next time that methodology was used in a similar operational environment, the seam would be known. The source report completed its processing journey 23 days after the operation. The analytical team that received it produced a secondary assessment. The secondary assessment was classified and did not generate any public record. What it found, in terms that the targeting team could not simply set aside, was that the procurement networks which had absorbed the coordinator's operational role had accelerated their own development in the months after his death. Not because of his death specifically, the timing was coincidental, but because the Hamas military logistics structure had been under sustained pressure and had responded to that pressure the way organizations under sustained pressure often respond, by distributing, redundifying, and deepening. The coordinator's supplier relationships, the Eastern European contacts, the front company infrastructure he had spent 3 years building, had been documented by him in formats that existed outside his own knowledge. They had been transferred, partially, to the newer networks in the months before his death, during the period when he was being managed out of his core role. He had not taken them with him, he had handed them over. The operation had removed a man who was already in the process of making himself replaceable. The networks that replaced him had inherited his tools. This was not the conclusion the targeting package had been built toward. The targeting package had been built on the premise that he was irreplaceable enough to justify the operational cost. The cost had been paid. The premise, the secondary assessment concluded with the careful language of people who understand what they are saying, may not have reflected the full organizational picture at time of execution, may not have. That phrase did a lot of work. Aleph received the secondary assessment summary through her chain. 3 paragraphs, as before. She read it in her office at a time that was not significant, and that she would later be unable to recall precisely. She had been in this work for 11 years. She understood that intelligence is always incomplete, always historical by the time it produces decisions, always a photograph of something that has already moved. She understood this structurally, intellectually, in the way that professionals understand the fundamental conditions of their field. Understanding it structurally is different from reading 3 paragraphs that describe, in careful institutional language, the specific shape of what you did not know when you gave a command that you cannot ungive. She filed no response. The process did not require one. She returned to her current operational caseload. The work continued. Somewhere in that European city, the daughter finished her degree. This is not a metaphor. She had enrolled, she had studied, she had walked across a stage to receive her diploma, and none of what happened 40 meters away that morning changed the fact that she had completed the work. The degree existed. What the 40 meters changed is harder to name and impossible to quantify and entirely absent from every document the operation produced. The facilities worker gave 3 interviews in the months following. He stopped giving interviews. He continued working at the university. He propped doors open with the same unconscious habit he had always had. Whether he still did it in that specific corridor, in that specific building, is not information that exists in any record. The procurement networks continued. The files on the 2 people who had absorbed the coordinator's supplier relationships were classified and active. The work of building those files looked, structurally, exactly like the work that had built the file on the coordinator. The operation was closed. The outcome was recorded as successful. What you have just watched is a documented intelligence framework applied to a real operational category: the targeted killing of a non-state military logistics figure on the soil of a non-hostile third country. The details of this specific operation are reconstructed from the logic of similar confirmed operations, investigative reporting on Mossad's post-October 7th targeting campaign, and the documented structure of how these decisions are made, authorized, and lived with afterward. The people inside these operations are not abstractions. The costs they accept are not abstract. The daughter is not a symbol. If this film made you uncomfortable, that discomfort is the correct response, not to Israel's targeting program specifically, not to Hamas specifically, but to the structure that makes this category of decision both legal and inevitable and unresolved. The question this operation leaves open is not whether it was right. It is whether right is the category that fits. That question is yours now.